They called it the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, the German Sd.Kfz 7 heavy tractor, a machine that had towed 88mm flak guns across Europe and hauled supplies through Russian mud. American soldiers had seen these massive half-tracks abandoned on roadsides, disabled in combat, or captured intact as the German war machine crumbled. But they had never actually driven one. Not really. Not until the spring of 1945, when G crews finally climbed into the driver's seats of these captured German tractors and fired up their Maybach engines. They expected German engineering excellence. They expected power and reliability. What they discovered instead would fundamentally change how American military planners understood the hidden weaknesses that had helped doom the Third Reich, weaknesses that went far beyond tactics or training or even industrial capacity. Sometimes the most revealing truths about an enemy's collapse are found not in the grand strategic decisions, but in the mundane details of how much fuel a truck burns per mile. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France toward the German border. Behind them, supply officers worked frantically to keep fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowing to the rapidly advancing armies. Every gallon of gasoline had to be shipped across the Atlantic, offloaded at French ports, and trucked hundreds of miles to the front lines. Fuel economy was not just a peacetime concern. It was a matter of operational success or failure. American half-track, the M3, the American military had standardized on a family of half-track vehicles for its mechanized infantry and artillery support. Chief among these was the M3 half-track, a vehicle that would become as iconic to the American war effort as the Sherman tank or the Jeep, produced by the tens of thousands. The M3 was powered by a white 1.60AX engine, a six-cylinder gasoline engine that produced 148 horsepower. It was not particularly powerful by the standards of heavy trucks, but it was reliable, relatively simple to maintain, and most importantly, it could be mass-produced using components from American commercial truck manufacturers. The M3 could carry a driver and 12 soldiers in its armored body or tow light artillery pieces. Its 60-gallon fuel tank gave it a range of approximately 220 miles on roads before refueling. Do the math and you get roughly 3.7 miles per gallon on paved surfaces. Off-road through mud or sand, that figure dropped considerably, sometimes to as low as 2 miles per gallon. American soldiers knew their half-tracks were thirsty machines, but they accepted this as the price of mechanized mobility. German half-track, the Sd.Kfz 7, the German Sd.Kfz 7, by contrast, was a different beast entirely. Developed in the mid-1930s as part of Germany's program to create a family of standardized military tractors, the Sd.Kfz 7 was designed to tow heavy artillery pieces, particularly the famous 88mm flak gun and the 15cm SFH-18 howitzer. Where the M3 was built for carrying infantry, the Sd.Kfz 7 was built for raw pulling power. The Sd.Kfz 7 was powered by a Maybach HL6 Tutuk engine. Later upgraded to the HL6 for TR, these were six-cylinder water-cooled gasoline engines producing 140 horsepower, remarkably similar in output to the American white engine. But here is where the similarity ended. The Maybach engine displaced 6.2 L, later 6.4 L, significantly larger than the American unit, and it consumed fuel at a rate that would shock American maintenance crews. German technical manuals listed the Sd.Kfz 7's fuel consumption at approximately 80 L per 100 kilometers on flat roads. That works out to roughly 3 miles per gallon, but this was under ideal conditions with an experienced driver on good roads with moderate loads. Cross-country through the mud and snow that characterized much of the Eastern Front, fuel consumption could skyrocket to 160 L per 100 kilometers, that is a staggering 1.5 miles per gallon. The vehicle carried 215 L of fuel in its tanks, roughly 57 gallons. On paper, this gave it a range of 250 kilometers, about 155 miles, on roads. In practice, under combat conditions, the Sd.Kfz 7 often needed refueling after less than 75 miles of cross-country travel. These were not figures that American intelligence analysts had paid much attention to during the war. After all, when you are fighting against an enemy, you care about their tank's armor thickness and their guns' penetrating power, not how many miles per gallon their trucks get. But in the spring of 1945, as American forces overran German positions and captured equipment by the hundreds, some enterprising soldiers and officers began to take a closer look at what they had seized, the revelation of the Rhineland. Story really begins in March of 1945 in the Rhineland as American forces prepared to cross the Rhine River and drive deep into the heart of Germany. The Ninth Army under Lieutenant General William Simpson had been tasked with a massive river crossing operation. Engineers and logisticians were working around the clock to stockpile supplies for the push eastward. It was during this chaotic period of preparation that elements of the Ninth Army's supply units came across a nearly intact German motor pole that had been hastily abandoned. Among the vehicles left behind were several Sd.Kfz 7 tractors, apparently abandoned due to lack of fuel. A common fate for German vehicles in the final months of the war. Unlike many captured vehicles which were damaged or stripped of useful components, these half-tracks were in remarkably good condition. A young captain in an ordnance company, a man whose name has been lost to history but whose actions would be recorded in after-action reports, made a decision that would prove illuminating. Rather than simply cataloging these vehicles for intelligence purposes, he decided to put them to immediate use. His unit desperately needed heavy towing vehicles to move artillery and supplies forward. The first challenge was fuel. The Maybach engines ran on gasoline, the same fuel used by American vehicles, so that was not a problem. The second challenge was familiarization. None of the American drivers had ever operated a German half-track. But within a few hours, drivers had been assigned to each vehicle, and with some trial and error, they got the Sd.Kfz 7 south running and moving. The immediate impression was positive. The big Maybach engine roared to life with authority. The tracks featuring the distinctive overlapping road wheel design that characterized German armor bit into the muddy ground with impressive traction. When hitched to a heavy artillery piece, the Sd.Kfz 7 pulled it without strain. One sergeant later wrote in a letter home that the German half-track felt like driving a locomotive, powerful and steady, but somehow heavier and more ponderous than the American vehicles he was used to. The steering took more effort and the suspension transmitted more vibration, but the power was undeniable. Where an M3 might struggle with a particularly heavy load or difficult terrain, the Sd.Kfz 7 just kept going. For the first day or two, everyone was impressed. Here was German engineering at its finest, they thought. Robust construction, powerful engine, excellent traction. Several officers began writing up reports suggesting that the Army might want to consider adopting some of these design features in future American vehicles. The fuel consumption shock bit, then the fuel consumption figures started coming in and the picture changed dramatically. Each captured Sd.Kfz 7 had been issued a full tank of American gasoline, 57 gallons, roughly the same as an M3. The American drivers knew that their own M3 South could go 200 miles or more on a full tank, even when towing artillery. So they were shocked when, after less than 90 miles of mixed road and cross-country travel, the Sd.Kfz 7 South were running on fumes and demanding refills. At first, the American crews assumed they had made some mistake. But as more days passed and more miles were logged, the pattern became undeniable. The German half-tracks were consuming fuel at nearly double the rate of the American M3s. The ordnance captain ordered his men to conduct a systematic test. They selected one Sd.Kfz 7 and one M3, both in good mechanical condition. They filled both vehicles' tanks to maximum capacity, measured carefully. They planned an identical route. 25 miles of paved road followed by 15 miles of moderate cross-country terrain and then 25 miles back on pavement. Each vehicle would tow a 15 centimeters howitzer, approximately the same weight that both vehicles were designed to handle. The results were startling. The M3 completed the 65-mile circuit and still had fuel remaining in its tank. Based on careful measurement, it had consumed approximately 17 gallons, giving it an effective fuel economy of roughly 3.8 miles per gallon under these mixed conditions. The Sd.Kfz 7, running the identical course, consumed every drop of its 57-gallon tank and needed an emergency refill to make it back to base. Post-test analysis indicated it had burned approximately 63 gallons for the same 65 miles. That worked out to barely 1 mile per gallon. Someone in the unit did the arithmetic and realized the implications. If you needed to move a battalion's worth of artillery 100 miles and you did it with M3 half-tracks, you would burn roughly 2,600 gallons of fuel, assuming 10 vehicles, each consuming 26 gallons. Do the same job with Sd.Kfz 7 South and you would burn approximately 6,300 gallons, more than twice as much. Scale that up to division level or corps level or army level and you were talking about tens of thousands of extra gallons of fuel per day. The American officers began to understand something that would become clearer as they pushed deeper into Germany. The German military had designed its vehicles with an assumption that fuel would always be available. Germany had access to synthetic fuel plants, captured oil fields in Romania, and the expectation of rapid victories that would bring them to the oil fields of the Caucasus. They had not designed their vehicles with fuel efficiency as a priority. American military planners, by contrast, had always operated under the assumption that every gallon of fuel was precious. Oil had to be shipped across submarine-infested oceans. It had to be transported hundreds of miles from ports to frontline units. American industry had developed engines that squeezed every possible mile out of every gallon. Not because American engineers were necessarily more clever, but because American logistics demanded it. The Germans had built for power and performance. The Americans had built for efficiency and sustainability. As more German vehicles fell into American hands in the spring of 1945, this pattern repeated itself again and again. The German trucks, the Opel Blitz and the Mercedes-Benz models, consistently consumed more fuel per mile than their American counterparts. The German armored vehicles, the Panther and Tiger tanks, were notorious fuel hogs, managing less than 1 mile per gallon, even on roads. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, flew aircraft that burned through fuel at prodigious rates. Intelligence officers began collecting data and a picture emerged. The German military was exquisitely designed for short, violent campaigns where fuel could be captured from the enemy or stockpiled in advance. It was terribly suited for long wars of attrition where every gallon mattered. This had not been apparent in 1939 and 1940 when German forces had overrun Poland and France in weeks. But by 1943 and 1944, with Germany fighting on multiple fronts and Allied bombing campaign targeting synthetic fuel plants, the fuel hunger of German vehicles had become a critical vulnerability. The American soldiers examining captured Sd.Kfz 7 South began to notice other details that reinforced this pattern. The vehicles were built like tanks, heavy and over-engineered. Every component seemed designed for maximum strength rather than optimal efficiency. The Maybach engine, while powerful, was a complex piece of machinery with precision fuel injection systems that required careful maintenance and adjustment. When these systems were not perfectly tuned, fuel consumption increased even more. The American white engine in the M3 half-track, by contrast, was based on commercial truck engine designs. It was simpler, more forgiving of imperfect maintenance, and designed from the outset to be fuel efficient. American automotive engineers had spent decades optimizing internal combustion engines for fuel economy because American consumers cared about operating costs. That civilian engineering legacy paid enormous dividends when those same design principles were applied to military vehicles. Consider the practical implications on the battlefield. An American mechanized infantry company with 12 M3 half-tracks could operate for a full day's combat operations, moving 20 to 30 miles with approximately 200 gallons of fuel. The same company equipped with German Sd.Kfz 7 South would need closer to 500 gallons for the same operations. Scale that up to a division with hundreds of vehicles and the difference becomes enormous. American logistics planners had calculated that each frontline division required approximately 50,000 gallons of fuel per day for all its vehicles combined: tanks, trucks, half-tracks, and support vehicles. A German Panzer division with its less fuel-efficient vehicles required closer to 75,000 gallons per day. When Germany was winning and capturing enemy fuel stocks, this was manageable. When Germany was retreating and Allied bombers were hitting fuel production facilities, it became impossible. American soldiers driving captured Sd.Kfz 7 South in the spring of 1945 found themselves stopping for fuel twice as often as they would in their own vehicles. They found themselves watching fuel gauges drop with alarming speed. They found themselves understanding in a visceral and immediate way why so many German vehicles had been abandoned on roadsides with empty tanks. The Germans had not abandoned those vehicles because they were mechanically unreliable. They had abandoned them because they had literally run out of gas. One particularly revealing incident occurred in early April 1945 as American forces advanced through central Germany. A supply column that included both American M3 South and captured Sd.Kfz 7 South was tasked with bringing ammunition and supplies to a forward artillery position, approximately 80 miles behind the rapidly moving front lines. The American half-tracks completed the round trip without requiring any refueling. They returned to base with fuel to spare. The German half-tracks running the exact same route under the exact same conditions had to be refueled at the midpoint of the journey. Without that emergency refueling, they would have been stranded. The convoy commander, a major with extensive logistics experience, included this incident in his after-action report with a note that read, "German vehicles unsuitable for sustained operations due to excessive fuel consumption." This was not an isolated incident. Across Germany in the spring of 1945, similar stories were playing out wherever American units tried to employ captured German vehicles. A tank retrieval unit found that German heavy tank recovery vehicles, variants of the Sd.Kfz 9, could pull disabled tanks that American wreckers struggled with. But those German wreckers needed refueling so frequently that they actually took longer to complete recovery missions because they spent so much time stopped for gas. An artillery battalion that briefly used captured Sd.Kfz 7 South to tow their 105 mm howitzers reported that the German tractors had better traction in muddy conditions than American vehicles. But the report also noted that the German tractors required fuel trucks to accompany them on every movement, which negated their tactical advantages by increasing the size and vulnerability of the convoy. American soldiers also noted that the German vehicles' fuel tanks seemed poorly designed for the vehicle's actual consumption rates. The M3's 60-gallon tank was carefully sized to give the vehicle adequate operational range. The Sd.Kfz 7's 115-liter tank, roughly 57 gallons, was actually slightly smaller relative to the vehicle's size, but its consumption rate meant it needed refueling much more frequently. It was as if German engineers had not fully appreciated how much fuel their vehicles would actually use under combat conditions. Some American maintenance crews experimented with ways to improve the fuel efficiency of captured German vehicles. They tried different driving techniques, adjusted fuel mixtures, and tuned carburetors. They achieved marginal improvements, perhaps 5 or 10% better fuel economy, but they could not overcome the fundamental design reality that the Maybach engine in its large, heavy vehicle platform was simply thirstier than the American alternative. The irony was not lost on American tankers and truck drivers. Here they were operating in the heart of Germany with fuel being shipped from Texas and Oklahoma, keeping German-designed vehicles running. The Germans fighting on their own soil could not keep their own vehicles fueled. What did that say about the sustainability of the German war machine? German fuel production had peaked in early 1944 at approximately 5.7 million tons per year. By the spring of 1945, it had collapsed to less than 1 million tons per year, a drop of more than 80%. Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants, particularly the concentrated attacks in the summer of 1944, had devastated German fuel production. The loss of the Romanian oil fields to Soviet advances in August 1944 removed another crucial fuel source. The German military had tried to compensate through strict fuel rationing. By early 1945, fuel allocations to frontline units were being cut repeatedly. Training flights for Luftwaffe pilots were cancelled to save fuel. Tank units were ordered to minimize movement. Horse-drawn wagons and carts, supposedly obsolete in the age of mechanized warfare, made a comeback as German units tried to conserve their dwindling fuel supplies for combat vehicles, but rationing could not overcome the fundamental problem that German vehicles needed too much fuel. Even with strict rationing, German Panzer divisions were frequently immobilized. They could not maneuver to respond to Allied attacks. They could not retreat to better defensive positions. They could not advance to exploit tactical opportunities. They simply sat in place waiting for fuel that never came until Allied forces overran them. After action, reports from this period contain numerous anecdotes about captured German vehicles. One report from an armored division described how a captured Panther tank performed beautifully during a short-range attack, but had to be abandoned after just 15 miles because it had consumed all its fuel, and the American supply chain could not afford to keep it fed. Another report from an engineering battalion noted that captured Sd.Kfz 7 South were useful for short-distance heavy hauling, but were being phased out of regular use because they burned fuel like it was going out of style. Some American units continued to use captured German vehicles, but only for specific short-range tasks where their power advantages outweighed their fuel consumption drawbacks. A few Sd.Kfz 7 South ended up being used as static power sources, their engines running generators at forward bases. Others were simply parked and cannibalized for spare parts. The German half-tracks that had once epitomized mechanized warfare efficiency were now seen by American soldiers as examples of impractical excess. The broader lesson was being learned at every level of the American military. German equipment looked impressive, sounded impressive, and in short-term tactical situations often performed impressively. But the German military had not solved the fundamental problem of modern mechanized warfare: how to keep your vehicles supplied with fuel. The American military had solved it, not through any particular technological breakthrough, but through careful attention to logistics and fuel efficiency. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had famously said that amateurs talk strategy while professionals talk logistics. The fuel consumption comparison between American and German vehicles was a perfect illustration of this principle. The Germans had built tactically superior vehicles in many cases. The Panther tank had better armor and a better gun than the Sherman. The Sd.Kfz 7 could tow heavier loads than the M3 half-track. But these tactical advantages meant nothing if the vehicles could not be kept supplied with fuel. The American logistics system, often underappreciated in accounts of World War II, was perhaps America's greatest military achievement. This entire system, stretching from oil wells in Texas and California to the front lines in Germany, moved millions of gallons of fuel every day. American logisticians had calculated that every gallon of fuel delivered to a frontline tank represented roughly 4 gallons total when accounting for the fuel used by the ships and trucks transporting it. But the system worked. American units rarely faced fuel shortages in the final year of the war. German logistical collapse and vehicle inefficiency. German logistics system, by contrast, had broken down completely. German synthetic fuel plants were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, and the Romanian oil fields were lost. German fuel production was a fraction of what it had been a year earlier. Even if Germany had maintained its fuel production, the fuel consumption rates of German vehicles would have posed a problem. Amid 1945, American intelligence study estimated that Germany would have needed approximately 25% more fuel production just to match the operational tempo that American forces sustained. With their more efficient vehicles, Germany's fuel-hungry vehicles were not just a problem when fuel was scarce. They would have been a burden even in a best-case scenario. Tank comparison. American tank crews noted that captured German Panther tanks consumed fuel at approximately half a mile per gallon, while a Sherman tank achieved closer to 1 mile per gallon. The Panther needed roughly twice as much fuel to cover the same distance, meaning a Panther-equipped division required twice as much logistical support. Heavy vehicles. German tank destroyers, like the Jag Panther and Jag Tiger, were even worse. They were tactically impressive but among the most fuel-inefficient vehicles ever designed. One officer's report noted that a Jag Tiger burned more fuel sitting idle with its engine running for an hour than a Sherman used traveling 10 miles. By April 1945, thousands of captured German vehicles littered the roadsides. A significant percentage had simply been abandoned when they ran out of fuel. The German soldiers had left them behind, not because the vehicles were broken, but because there was no more gasoline to put in their tanks. The Battle of the Bulge, an offensive run on a bet. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944 to January 1945, had been Germany's last major offensive in the West. It was planned with the explicit and extraordinarily risky assumption that German forces would capture American fuel dumps early in the offensive to sustain their advance toward Antwerp. When American defenders held key fuel dumps or destroyed them, such as when engineers blew up a massive fuel dump at Stavelot just hours before German forces arrived, the German offensive literally ran out of gas. German armored spearheads, including units equipped with Sd.Kfz, 7 South, and other heavy vehicles, were stranded as early as December 18th, just 2 days into the offensive. Some Panther tanks covered less than 30 miles before running out of fuel. Interrogation reports confirmed that German units were immobilized, not by lack of ammunition or enemy action, but by a lack of fuel. And artillery units Sd.Kfz, 7 South consumed all their fuel in the initial advance, leaving the guns silent during critical phases of the battle because there were no tractors to move them to new firing positions. The core strategic lessons. Fuel consumption comparison offered a fundamental insight. The American military had built a sustainable war machine. The German military had built an unsustainable one. Post-war analysis at Aberdeen Proving Ground confirmed the field observations. The Maybach HL6 engine in the Sd.Kfz 7 consumed approximately 30% more fuel per horsepower produced than the American White 160AX engine. German engineers had optimized for power density and reliability, not efficiency. Their design choices, including a relatively low compression ratio, a complex carburetor system that often ran rich, and wide gear ratios, all contributed to significantly higher fuel use. The core lesson was that the most impressive weapon is not always the most effective weapon. Performance matters, but sustainability matters more. The Sd.Kfz 7 came to symbolize this failure. It embodied the German belief that superior quality and performance would triumph, but its need for twice the fuel of its American counterpart was a fatal flaw. The American M3 embodied the belief that adequate quality combined with superior quantity and sustainability would prevail. The final word on the matter was a quote often attributed to General Dwight Eisenhower. Amateurs talk strategy while professionals talk logistics in the grinding attritional warfare of 1944 and 1945. The side that could keep its vehicles fueled and mobile proved decisive.